Ma'am, you don't belong in first class. Pick up your bag and leave this aircraft. The words landed with the cold certainty of someone who had never expected to be questioned. Captain Daniel Brooks stood at the entrance to the premium cabin with one hand resting against the cockpit door, his uniform perfectly pressed, his expression even sharper. Around him, conversations faded into uneasy silence as passengers looked up from coffee cups, laptops, and morning newspapers. Flight 218 from Chicago to New York had been scheduled to push back in less than 20 minutes, and until that moment, everything had moved with the polished rhythm expected from one of the country's most respected airlines. The woman standing in seat 1A did not argue. She looked to be in her mid-40s, dressed in dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple navy sweater that carried no designer logo, no obvious sign of wealth, no hint that she belonged anywhere except among ordinary travelers. Her name was Monica Hayes. She had boarded quietly with a valid boarding pass, thanked the gate agent with a warm smile, and settled into her seat with nothing more than a slim leather briefcase resting beside her. Yet something about her calm seemed to irritate Captain Brooks more than open defiance ever could. "I'm speaking to you," he said, his voice louder now. "That seat is reserved for premium guests." Monica slowly lifted her boarding pass without the slightest tremor in her hand. "It is my seat," she answered softly. He barely glanced at the document before pushing it back toward her. "There's been a mistake." A businessman across the aisle lowered his tablet just enough to watch. An elderly couple exchanged uncertain looks. 2 rows behind them, a young travel blogger quietly reached for her phone, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted from routine to unforgettable. A newly hired flight attendant named Emily Carter stood frozen near the galley, her training telling her to trust the captain, while her instincts whispered that something about this scene felt deeply wrong. Monica remained seated. She neither crossed her arms nor raised her voice. She simply rested her hands together and looked out the window toward the runway shimmering beneath the early summer sun. She had seen that look before. Not the captain's face specifically, but the quiet confidence of someone convinced appearances told the entire story. Years earlier, another airport, another uniform, another assumption had tried to decide where she belonged before asking a single question. Those memories had never disappeared. They had simply become fuel. Captain Brooks folded his arms. "If you refuse to cooperate, airport security will escort you off the plane." His words echoed through the cabin, but Monica's expression never changed. She turned her eyes back toward him with remarkable composure, as though she were measuring something far larger than the moment itself. Then she reached into her briefcase, unlocked her phone, and typed exactly one word before setting it back down on her lap. "Proceed." No one in first class noticed the message leave her screen. No one could have guessed that somewhere beyond the jet bridge, invisible wheels had already begun turning, and that before this aircraft ever left the gate, every assumption inside cabin 1 would be tested in ways none of them could possibly imagine. Captain Daniel Brooks took one deliberate step closer, his polished shoes stopping beside seat 1A as if the narrow aisle itself belonged to him. The surrounding cabin remained silent, but the silence no longer felt comfortable. It carried the weight of expectation. Monica Hayes slowly placed her phone back inside her briefcase and looked up without the slightest trace of frustration. Her composure confused people. Most passengers expected anger, pleading, or embarrassment. Instead, she offered none of them. Emily Carter, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, glanced toward the electronic passenger manifest on the service tablet in her hands. She had checked hundreds of boarding records during training, and everything about seat 1A appeared ordinary. The reservation displayed a confirmed ticket, a completed check-in, and a first-class upgrade that had never been revoked. Emily quietly cleared her throat. "Captain, the system still shows this seat assigned." Daniel barely turned his head. "Run it again." Emily obeyed. The same confirmation appeared a second time. Across the aisle, Richard Lawson, a successful real estate investor from Connecticut, folded his newspaper and watched with growing curiosity. His wife, Claire, leaned closer and whispered, "If her boarding pass scanned, why is she still being questioned?" Richard shrugged but kept watching. He had spent enough years in boardrooms to recognize when confidence crossed the line into arrogance. Near the front galley, senior flight attendant Nicole Simmons crossed her arms. "Sometimes people find ways around the system," she said quietly, though her words were loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It happens more often than you think." Monica looked toward Nicole with the same calm expression she had worn since boarding. "Then I am sure the system will tell you the truth." Nicole smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that carried doubt instead of reassurance. "The system is not always perfect." Monica nodded once. "Neither are people." That single sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Emily lowered her eyes to the tablet again, scrolling through the reservation history. Every entry matched. The payment had cleared. The loyalty account was verified. There were no security flags, no seating conflicts, and no irregularities. She quietly stepped toward Nicole and whispered, "Everything checks out." Nicole answered without looking at the screen. "Captain already made his decision." Those words settled heavily over Emily. She had joined the airline believing every decision would begin with facts. Instead, she was watching assumptions replace verification. 3 rows behind first class, a travel creator named Olivia Bennett discreetly angled her phone toward the front of the cabin. She was not streaming. She simply felt compelled to preserve what she was witnessing. The comments she had read online about travelers being judged by appearance suddenly seemed far less distant than they had the night before. Monica remained seated, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the armrest while sunlight poured through the oval window beside her. Outside, baggage carts crossed the ramp and fuel trucks completed their final checks as if nothing unusual was unfolding inside the aircraft. Yet somewhere beyond the jet bridge, a message containing only one word had already reached the people who understood exactly what it meant. Quietly, without alarms or public announcements, phones began vibrating inside executive offices miles away, calendars were interrupted, secure conference lines opened, and a carefully rehearsed routine started moving toward Flight 218 with the precision of a clock that never ran late. Captain Daniel Brooks reached for the interphone mounted beside the cockpit door, pressing a single button with practiced confidence. "Ground operations," he said evenly. "I need airport security at gate 24. We have a passenger refusing a crew instruction in the first-class cabin." Several heads turned at once. The phrase refusing a crew instruction sounded far more serious than what anyone had actually witnessed. Monica Hayes had never raised her voice. She had never left her seat. She had done nothing except present a valid boarding pass and answer every question with calm precision. Yet the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted immediately. A middle-aged couple quietly gathered their belongings as though expecting a major disruption. Richard Lawson continued watching without saying a word, while Claire looked from Monica to the captain with growing disbelief. "She has been completely respectful," Claire whispered. Richard nodded slowly. "That is exactly what makes this difficult to understand." Emily Carter could feel her pulse quicken. Her training emphasized professionalism, accuracy, and treating every passenger with dignity. She looked once more at the electronic manifest, hoping to discover some overlooked detail that would justify the escalating situation. There was nothing. Every record remained unchanged. Monica Hayes. Seat 1 Alpha. Confirmed. Verified. Premium loyalty status. Boarding complete. Emily swallowed and spoke carefully. "Captain, there are still no discrepancies in her reservation," Daniel answered without hesitation. "Close the tablet." Emily hesitated for only a second before lowering the screen. She understood chain of command, but she also understood facts. Those two things no longer seemed to agree. Nicole Simmons stepped into the aisle with a courteous smile directed toward the surrounding passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are resolving a seating issue before departure." The explanation sounded polished, but it left out the most important truth. There was no seating issue. There was only an assumption that refused to disappear. Olivia Bennett continued holding her phone at chest level, recording quietly without drawing attention to herself. She noticed something unusual. Monica was not looking toward the captain anymore. Instead, she occasionally glanced at the aircraft door as though she were waiting for someone who had not arrived yet. There was no anxiety in her expression. No frustration. Only patience. The kind of patience that belonged to someone who understood exactly how much time remained before everything changed. Outside the window, the jet bridge stayed connected longer than scheduled. A baggage cart stopped instead of driving away. 2 airport supervisors appeared near the gate podium, speaking into headsets while checking messages on their phones. Their movements were calm but unusually deliberate. Inside the cabin, none of the passengers understood why the normal rhythm of departure had quietly slowed. Monica folded her hands together once more and looked toward Emily. "You have been very kind," she said softly. Emily managed a faint smile. "I am only trying to do my job." Monica returned the smile with quiet sincerity. "Keep doing it that way." Those simple words stayed with Emily longer than any instruction she had received during training. At that same moment, nearly 5 miles from the airport, an executive conference room emptied in less than 60 seconds. Senior leaders left unfinished meetings, legal counsel gathered incident reports, and the chairman of the board closed the presentation with only one sentence. "We are going to the airport now." Back inside Flight 218, Captain Brooks remained convinced he was protecting company standards. He had no idea that the very people responsible for defining those standards were already on their way to his aircraft. The soft chime above the cabin door sounded once, then twice, signaling another delay that no one had expected. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances as departure time slipped past without explanation. Captain Daniel Brooks checked his watch, his patience thinning with every passing second. He believed the delay existed because one passenger refused to follow instructions. Monica Hayes knew better. She sat with the same quiet composure, her attention drifting briefly toward the jet bridge before returning to the window. The sunlight reflected across the wing, painting long silver lines over the polished metal while ground crews continued moving with unusual purpose below. Emily Carter could no longer ignore the contradiction unfolding in front of her. She stepped discreetly toward the gate communication panel and requested another verification from operations. Moments later, the response appeared on her screen. Passenger confirmed. Seat assignment confirmed. No security concerns. Priority executive travel classification active. Emily stared at the final line longer than the others. She had never seen that classification attached to an ordinary traveler. Before she could say anything, Nicole Simmons gently lowered the tablet. "That information is not relevant," she whispered. Emily looked surprised. "How could it not be relevant?" Nicole answered with quiet certainty. "Because the captain has already made his decision." Those words settled over Emily like a weight she could not shake. Across the aisle, Claire Lawson finally spoke aloud. "Excuse me, Captain?" Daniel turned toward her with professional courtesy. "Yes, ma'am?" Claire folded her hands calmly. "Everything I have seen suggests this passenger has been respectful from the moment she boarded. Is there information the rest of us are missing?" Daniel paused for only a heartbeat. "This is an operational matter, and I appreciate your patience." Richard Lawson watched Monica instead of the captain. During 3 decades of negotiating billion-dollar commercial developments, he had learned that genuine confidence rarely announced itself. It simply waited. Monica carried that same quiet certainty. Olivia Bennett stopped pretending to check messages and continued recording discreetly. She noticed something almost no one else did. Monica never once looked around for approval from the other passengers. She was not trying to win an argument. She was allowing events to unfold exactly as they were. That realization sent a chill through Olivia. People who knew they were losing usually became louder. Monica had become even quieter. Then another unexpected development unfolded. Every crew tablet inside the first-class cabin displayed a brief system notification before the screen automatically locked for several seconds. Nicole frowned. Emily tapped the display twice, but the message disappeared before she could read more than a single sentence. Executive Operations Override initiated. When the screens unlocked, everything appeared normal again, yet Emily could not ignore what she had seen. "Captain," she said cautiously, "the onboard system just received an executive notification." Daniel barely looked up. "Probably a software update." Emily wanted to believe him, but the explanation did not fit. Airline software updates did not arrive seconds before departure, and they certainly did not reference executive operations. Outside the aircraft, a black company vehicle rolled quietly onto the ramp and stopped near the gate. Two senior airport administrators stepped out, followed by several men and women in business attire carrying identification badges instead of luggage. None of them hurried. They moved with calm purpose, exchanging only a few measured words before walking toward the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, Captain Brooks remained focused on Monica Hayes, convinced that he was still in complete control of the situation. What he could not see was that the balance of authority had already shifted. It simply had not reached the cabin door yet. The cabin door remained open far longer than anyone expected, and the delay began to wear on the passengers. Soft conversations replaced the earlier silence, each whisper adding another layer of uncertainty to the atmosphere. Monica Hayes remained exactly where she had been since boarding, her posture relaxed, her attention drifting briefly toward the front of the aircraft before returning to the window. She looked less like someone waiting for permission to stay and more like someone patiently allowing a clock to reach the exact moment it was meant to strike. Richard Lawson finally stood from his seat, buttoning his jacket before addressing Captain Daniel Brooks in an even tone. "Captain, I have spent 30 years managing corporate negotiations. I have learned that facts usually solve problems faster than assumptions. If her ticket is valid, perhaps we should begin there." Daniel offered a restrained smile that carried little warmth. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but this remains a crew matter." Richard nodded politely, though disappointment settled across his face. Sometimes a crew matter becomes a company matter before anyone realizes it. Those words lingered in the aisle long after he sat down. Olivia Bennett quietly lowered her phone for a moment, studying Monica instead of recording her. She had interviewed public figures, athletes, and elected officials over the years, and one characteristic always stood out. The people with the greatest authority rarely felt compelled to prove it. Monica displayed that same quiet confidence. She never searched the faces around her for sympathy. She never attempted to convince anyone that she belonged. Emily Carter noticed the same thing. Every instinct told her that this passenger was carrying a truth far larger than anyone aboard understood. Near the second row, an older retired Air Force officer named Thomas Reynolds removed his reading glasses and spoke with calm conviction. "Captain, respect is part of professionalism. This lady has shown your crew nothing but respect," Daniel answered with measured firmness. "And I expect the same respect for crew instructions." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "Respect flows both directions." Nicole Simmons shifted uncomfortably, sensing that public opinion inside the cabin was beginning to change. Fewer passengers were watching Monica with suspicion. More were watching the captain with concern. Outside the aircraft, the small group of executives reached the gate podium where airport personnel immediately stepped aside. Identification badges were presented only briefly before secure doors opened without hesitation. None of the arriving officials appeared rushed, but every movement carried unmistakable purpose. A gate supervisor glanced toward the aircraft with widened eyes before quietly lifting the phone at the podium. Seconds later, Emily's tablet chimed once more. Another notification appeared across the screen, remaining visible this time. Executive Leadership Boarding Authorization approved. Mandatory crew standby. Emily felt her breath catch. She had never seen such a message during training or in active service. Before she could show anyone, Monica looked up from her seat and met her eyes with a calm, reassuring expression. She did not smile widely. She simply gave the slightest nod, almost as if thanking Emily for trusting facts instead of appearances. The gesture lasted no more than a second, yet it steadied Emily's nerves in a way no company handbook ever could. At the front of the aircraft, Captain Brooks heard footsteps approaching through the jet bridge. Assuming airport security had finally arrived, he straightened his uniform, confident that the situation was about to end exactly as he had planned. What waited beyond the cabin door, however, was not the confirmation he expected. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would force everyone on board to reconsider the difference between authority earned through a title and authority revealed through character. The footsteps outside the aircraft grew louder until they stopped just beyond the open cabin door. Captain Daniel Brooks drew a slow breath, convinced airport security had arrived to remove what he believed was the final obstacle delaying departure. Instead of stepping aside, he turned once more toward Monica Hayes. "This is your last opportunity to leave the aircraft voluntarily," he said with measured authority. "Once additional personnel come on board, the decision will no longer be yours." Monica looked at him calmly, her expression unchanged. "I understand exactly whose decision it will be." The confidence in her voice was quiet, but it settled over the cabin with unexpected weight. Daniel interpreted it as stubbornness. Richard Lawson heard something entirely different. Claire gently touched her husband's arm. "She still is not afraid," she whispered. Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Monica. "People are not this calm unless they know something the rest of us do not." Nicole Simmons folded her arms more tightly, trying to project certainty even as uncertainty continued spreading through the first-class cabin. Emily Carter remained near the galley, her tablet resting against her side. The executive notification still lingered in her thoughts. She wanted to speak again, but every attempt to do the right thing seemed to disappear beneath decisions that had already been made. Monica slowly looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of several passengers one by one. There was no resentment in her expression. No anger. Only disappointment. "It is remarkable," she said softly, almost to herself, "how quickly people decide where someone belongs before learning who they are." The words lingered in the quiet cabin. Thomas Reynolds removed his glasses again. "That is true in more places than airports," he said. Olivia Bennett lowered her phone for a brief moment. She had expected drama when she first started recording. Instead, she was witnessing something much more powerful. One person refusing to surrender her dignity, while everyone around her struggled with assumptions they had never questioned before. Outside the aircraft, several airport employees stepped away from the jet bridge entrance, clearing a path without being instructed. Gate agents straightened their uniforms. Ramp supervisors quietly stopped nearby conversations. Something important was happening, although very few people understood exactly what it was. Inside the cockpit doorway, Daniel received a brief message through his headset. He listened for several seconds before replying. "Understood." When the transmission ended, he turned confidently toward the cabin. "Company representatives are coming aboard," he announced. "They will assist in resolving this matter." Nicole released a small breath of relief. Emily noticed something Daniel did not. The message had not sounded like an order. It had sounded like a notification. Monica reached into her briefcase once more and removed nothing except a slim notebook, placing it neatly on her lap before folding her hands again. She looked less like someone preparing for confrontation and more like someone preparing for an ordinary business meeting. Richard quietly smiled to himself. The image suddenly made perfect sense. Across the aisle, Claire noticed the same detail. "Look at her," she whispered. "She has been ready for whatever comes next from the very beginning." The aircraft remained perfectly still at the gate. The engines had not started. The cabin lights glowed warmly above rows of silent passengers. Then the sound of polished dress shoes echoed across the jet bridge once more, followed by several calm voices exchanging professional greetings. Every conversation inside the cabin stopped. Every eye turned toward the open door. Even Captain Brooks instinctively adjusted his jacket before facing the entrance, completely unaware that the people about to step aboard were not arriving to support his judgment. They were arriving to evaluate it. For the first time since boarding, Monica Hayes allowed herself a long, quiet breath. The sounds inside the cabin seemed to fade until all she could hear was the distant hum of the airport beyond the window. She had lived through moments like this before. Different cities. Different uniforms. Different faces. Yet somehow the assumptions always arrived wearing the same expression. 23 years earlier she had stood alone inside a regional airport after completing graduate school, carrying nothing more than a garment bag, a notebook, and a dream that seemed much larger than her bank account. She still remembered the gate agent who glanced at her ticket, looked at her clothes, and asked if she was sure she belonged in the priority boarding line. She remembered stepping aside without arguing because she believed proving herself through hard work would eventually be enough. Years later, after building successful companies, leading thousands of employees, and negotiating acquisitions worth billions of dollars, she realized something painful. Success could change a title, a balance sheet, or a boardroom, but it could not always erase the assumptions waiting in someone else's mind. That realization had never made her bitter. It had made her determined. She chose to lead differently because she never wanted another traveler, employee, or customer to wonder whether dignity depended on appearance. The memory quietly dissolved as the present returned. Monica lifted her eyes toward the cabin once more. Emily Carter stood near the galley, clearly struggling between loyalty to procedure and loyalty to truth. Richard Lawson watched with thoughtful silence, while Claire offered Monica a gentle smile that asked for nothing in return. Thomas Reynolds rested both hands on the handle of his cane. His years of military service reflected not in his posture but in the calm patience with which he observed every detail. Olivia Bennet lowered her phone completely. At some point she had stopped recording for the story and started watching because she genuinely wanted to understand the woman sitting in seat 1 Alpha. Monica noticed every one of them. She also noticed Captain Daniel Brooks standing confidently near the cockpit, convinced that the next few minutes would validate every decision he had made. She did not resent him. She felt something far more complicated. Disappointment. Not because he questioned her, but because he had stopped questioning himself. Leadership, she had learned long ago, was never measured by the authority to make decisions. It was measured by the willingness to examine them. Outside the aircraft, the executive delegation had nearly reached the cabin door. Quiet conversations echoed faintly through the jet bridge before disappearing altogether. A gate supervisor stepped respectfully aside, followed by 2 airport directors who straightened their jackets as though preparing for an important meeting rather than an ordinary boarding delay. Monica glanced once at the notebook resting on her lap. Inside were handwritten notes from visits to airports across the country, observations gathered quietly over months, stories shared by employees and passengers who believed no one in leadership was listening. Today had never been about claiming a seat. It had always been about discovering whether the culture she had promised to build truly existed beyond corporate presentations and mission statements. She gently closed the notebook and rested one hand upon it. Whatever happened next would not simply determine the outcome of one delayed flight. It would reveal the character of an entire organization, beginning with the people standing only a few steps away from the open cabin door. The first person to appear in the aircraft doorway was not a security officer. It was the airline's vice president of airport operations, followed by the director of corporate compliance, the chief legal counsel, and finally an older gentleman whose calm presence immediately changed the atmosphere around the entrance. None of them spoke as they stepped into the cabin. Their eyes moved carefully from the captain to the crew, then to Monica Hayes seated quietly in seat 1 Alpha. Captain Daniel Brooks smiled with visible relief and walked forward confidently. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said. "We have a passenger refusing crew instructions, and we are prepared to resolve the situation." The executives listened without interruption. The older gentleman simply asked, "Has the passenger presented valid travel credentials?" Daniel answered immediately. "Yes, but there are additional concerns regarding suitability for the cabin." Emily Carter lowered her eyes. Those words sounded different now that senior leadership was listening. The director of corporate compliance turned toward Emily. "Were the credentials verified through the reservation system?" Emily hesitated only long enough to remind herself that honesty was part of her job. "Yes, sir. I verified them 3 separate times. Every record matched. There were no security alerts, no payment issues, and no seating conflicts." Silence settled across the first-class cabin. Nicole Simmons shifted her weight uneasily. Richard Lawson exchanged a knowing glance with Claire. Thomas Reynolds rested both hands on his cane, saying nothing because he sensed the truth was beginning to surface on its own. The older executive slowly walked farther into the cabin until he stood only a few feet from Monica. She calmly looked up at him and offered a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he replied with equal warmth. There was no surprise in either voice. It sounded less like strangers meeting and more like colleagues arriving for an expected appointment. Olivia Bennet quietly resumed recording, careful not to make a sound. She felt the atmosphere changing in ways words could barely explain. Authority inside the aircraft was no longer flowing from rank alone. It was shifting toward truth. The vice president turned toward Captain Brooks. "Before we continue, I would like every crew member to remain exactly where they are." Daniel blinked with mild confusion. "Of course." The director of corporate compliance opened a tablet and reviewed several time-stamped entries before speaking again. "We have already received the electronic boarding records, crew communications, gate activity logs, and cabin system notifications associated with this flight." Emily looked up in surprise. Everything had been reviewed far faster than she thought possible. Monica remained perfectly still. She had not interrupted once. She had not defended herself. She had simply allowed the organization to examine its own decisions. The older executive stopped beside seat 1 Alpha and looked around the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "thank you for your patience this morning. Before this flight departs, there is one important matter that must be addressed." Every passenger watched in complete silence. Even Captain Brooks sensed that the conversation had begun moving beyond his control. Monica gently closed her notebook and rested both hands upon it. The quiet confidence she had carried since boarding never changed. She had not come to win an argument. She had come to discover whether the values printed in every employee handbook still existed when no one believed the person in front of them had the power to hold them accountable. Within the next few moments, everyone on board would learn that the real inspection had never been about a boarding pass. It had been about character. The older executive allowed the silence to settle before taking one final step toward Monica Hayes. Then, in full view of every passenger and every member of the flight crew, he extended his hand with unmistakable respect. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Hayes," he said. "We apologize for the delay. The board has been waiting for you." Monica stood gracefully and accepted the handshake with a warm but measured smile. "Thank you, Charles," she replied. "I appreciate everyone coming so quickly." Captain Daniel Brooks froze. His confident posture disappeared almost instantly as he searched the faces of the executives for some sign that he had misunderstood what was happening. Instead, he found only calm professionalism. Charles turned toward the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Charles Whitmore, chairman of the board. Before this flight departs, I would like to introduce someone many of you have unknowingly met this morning." Every eye shifted toward Monica. Even the cabin crew seemed unable to look anywhere else. Charles continued. "This is Monica Hayes, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Horizon American Airlines. She officially assumed leadership this morning following the completion of our strategic transition." The words seemed to suspend time itself. Richard Lawson slowly removed his glasses, unable to hide a faint smile. Claire covered her mouth in quiet astonishment. Thomas Reynolds gave a slow nod, as though a question that had lingered in his mind since boarding had finally received its answer. Olivia Bennet felt her heart race as she realized the recording in her hand had captured something far greater than an ordinary travel dispute. Emily Carter stood completely still, her eyes filling with relief more than surprise. She had trusted the reservation system because it had told the truth. Now the truth stood before everyone in the cabin. Nicole Simmons lowered her gaze toward the floor, replaying every decision she had made during the past 30 minutes. Captain Brooks struggled to find words. "Chief Executive Officer?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Charles met his eyes. "Yes, Captain." Ms. Hayes requested complete privacy for today's observation flight. Only a very limited number of senior leaders were informed of her travel plans. Monica looked around the cabin before speaking. Her voice remained calm, carrying neither triumph nor anger. I boarded exactly as thousands of our passengers do every single day. I carried a valid ticket, followed every instruction, and trusted our people to follow company standards. She paused briefly, allowing every sentence to settle naturally. I never asked anyone to recognize my title. I only hoped they would respect my humanity. No one interrupted. There was nothing left to interrupt. Charles slowly opened a slim folder and handed it to the Director of Corporate Compliance before addressing the cabin once more. Every interaction from the moment Ms. Hayes entered the gate area has already been preserved through operational records, communication logs, and witness statements. We will review the facts carefully and fairly. Monica nodded in agreement. That is exactly why I came today, she said. Not to discover whether employees recognize executives, but to discover how they treat someone they believe has no authority at all. Captain Brooks lowered his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. The certainty that had guided every decision only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved beneath the weight of a truth he never imagined was waiting behind the simple boarding pass he had refused to trust. No one in the first-class cabin spoke for several long seconds. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization. Captain Daniel Brooks stood motionless near the cockpit door, his shoulders still squared by habit, yet the confidence that had filled his voice only moments earlier had disappeared. Nicole Simmons slowly unclasped her hands, staring at the floor as every conversation from the past half-hour replayed in her mind with painful clarity. Emily Carter felt a quiet sense of relief wash over her. The reservation system had never failed. The facts had never changed. Only the assumptions had. Charles Whitmore looked toward the Director of Corporate Compliance, who opened the electronic report already prepared on the company tablet. For the record, he said calmly, the boarding pass presented by Ms. Hayes was valid from the moment she entered the gate. Seat 1 Alpha was properly assigned. Every verification performed by the reservation system confirmed her identity. There were no operational concerns requiring removal from this aircraft. His words were measured and professional, but each sentence carried undeniable weight. Richard Lawson leaned back in his seat and quietly exhaled. Facts usually have remarkable patience, he said softly to Claire. They never need to shout. Claire nodded, unable to take her eyes off Monica. Thomas Reynolds smiled faintly beneath years of quiet discipline. Character reveals itself under pressure, he murmured. Every single time. Olivia Bennett lowered her phone for the first time since the executives boarded. She realized the most powerful moment she had witnessed was not the announcement that Monica was the chief executive officer. It was everything that had happened before anyone knew. Monica remained standing beside her seat, showing no sign of satisfaction or resentment. She looked toward Emily first. Thank you for trusting the information instead of the assumptions, she said warmly. Emily felt her eyes begin to water. I was only trying to follow the truth, ma'am. Monica smiled gently. Never let anyone convince you that the truth is less important than convenience. Emily quietly nodded, knowing she would remember those words for the rest of her career. Charles then turned toward the passengers. On behalf of the board of directors, I sincerely apologize to every customer aboard this flight for the delay and for the experience you have witnessed today. Respect is not a marketing slogan. It is a company standard, and when we fail to uphold it, we must acknowledge it honestly. Several passengers responded with quiet applause that gradually spread through the cabin. It was not applause celebrating someone's embarrassment. It was recognition that honesty had finally entered the conversation. Captain Brooks slowly stepped forward. His voice was noticeably different from before, quieter and stripped of certainty. Ms. Hayes, he said, I made my judgment before I allowed the facts to guide me. For that, I sincerely apologize. Monica met his eyes without hostility. Captain, leadership is not measured by never making mistakes. It is measured by whether we are willing to learn from them. The words settled gently over everyone listening. There was no triumph in her voice. Only conviction. Charles closed the electronic report and looked once around the cabin. The delayed flight had quietly become something far more significant than a transportation schedule. It had become a mirror reflecting the culture of an entire organization. Every employee, every passenger, and every executive had now seen exactly what happened when appearances were allowed to speak louder than evidence, and no one aboard would leave the aircraft unchanged by what they had witnessed. Charles Whitmore closed the folder and exchanged a quiet glance with the Director of Corporate Compliance before speaking again. "The purpose of today's visit was never to embarrass anyone," he said evenly. "It was to determine whether our standards remained intact when no one believed leadership was watching." His words carried through the cabin without the need for raised voices. The Director of Corporate Compliance stepped forward holding the company tablet. "Based on the verified operational records, reservation logs, witness accounts, and crew communications collected during this incident, the review process will begin immediately." Captain Daniel Brooks remained silent, listening carefully to every sentence. Nicole Simmons stood with her hands folded, her earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful reflection. Charles continued. "Effective immediately, Captain Brooks and Senior Flight Attendant Simmons are relieved from operating this flight pending a formal review in accordance with company policy. This is an administrative action, not a final determination. Every employee deserves a fair process built on evidence." Neither employee protested. Both simply nodded in acknowledgement. Monica Hayes watched quietly, her expression unchanged. She had never wanted a public spectacle. She had wanted accountability grounded in fairness. Charles then turned toward Emily Carter. "Miss Carter, until a replacement crew arrives, thank you for your professionalism and for accurately reporting what the reservation system showed." Emily looked almost startled. "I was only doing my responsibility, sir." Monica smiled warmly. "That is exactly how integrity begins. One honest decision at a time." Emily felt years older in that single moment. Not because of authority, but because she finally understood what responsible leadership looked like. Richard Lawson quietly applauded once, followed by Claire, then Thomas Reynolds, and soon several other passengers joined them. The applause remained respectful, recognizing honesty rather than celebrating anyone's discomfort. Olivia Bennett lowered her phone and simply observed. She realized the most meaningful story was no longer about an executive revealing her title. It was about an organization choosing transparency over pride. Captain Brooks stepped toward Monica once more. "I cannot change what happened this morning," he said sincerely. "But I can make certain I never repeat it." Monica nodded gently. "That is all anyone can ask from a leader. Mistakes become dangerous only when we refuse to learn from them." Nicole took a slow breath before speaking. "I should have trusted the verified information instead of assuming the captain had already reached the correct conclusion. I understand that now," Monica answered with calm sincerity. "The strongest organizations are built by people willing to question assumptions before they become decisions." Charles looked toward the open cabin door where a replacement captain and 2 additional flight attendants were already waiting with airport operations. "Your replacement crew is prepared to continue today's flight," he announced. "We will complete the transition as efficiently as possible." Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge remained quiet while operations staff coordinated the final details. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The tension that had filled the aisle only minutes earlier had been replaced by reflection. Passengers were no longer watching a confrontation. They were witnessing a company hold itself accountable in real time. Monica gathered her notebook and placed it carefully inside her briefcase. She looked once around the cabin, not as someone who had won an argument, but as someone who had confirmed why the work ahead mattered even more than the title she carried. The real journey had never been the flight to New York. It was the longer journey of building a culture where every passenger would be treated with dignity long before anyone asked what position they held. The replacement captain stepped into the cockpit while ground crews quietly completed the final departure checks outside. Inside the first-class cabin, however, no one seemed concerned about the schedule anymore. The conversation everyone would remember had already taken place. Monica Hayes returned to seat 1 Alpha, placed her briefcase beneath the seat in front of her, and looked once more through the oval window toward the busy ramp. Aircraft continued arriving and departing across the airport exactly as they always had, reminding her that organizations, much like airports, never stopped moving. The only question was whether they moved in the right direction. Charles Whitmore remained standing near the front of the cabin before addressing the passengers one final time. "Thank you for your extraordinary patience today," he said. "Your professionalism and honesty helped us see this situation clearly. On behalf of our board of directors, we are grateful." Several passengers nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Richard Lawson looked toward Monica with genuine respect. "You could have revealed who you were the moment someone questioned you," he said. "Why did you wait?" Monica smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Because if people only treat someone with dignity after discovering a title, then they were never respecting the person. They were respecting the position." The cabin fell silent again. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any prepared speech. Claire gently reached for Richard's hand. Thomas Reynolds looked toward the window with a reflective smile. Olivia Bennet slowly placed her phone inside her bag. She realized that no recording could fully capture what had happened inside the aircraft because the most important change had taken place within the people who witnessed it. Emily Carter stepped forward before returning to her assigned duties. "Ms. Hayes," she said quietly, "thank you for reminding me why I wanted to work in aviation. I wanted people to feel welcome the moment they stepped onto an airplane." Monica stood and lightly shook Emily's hand. "Never lose that purpose," she replied. "Policies matter. Procedures matter. But people remember how they were treated long after they forget the flight number." Emily smiled, holding those words close as though they had become part of her own career. Captain Daniel Brooks and Nicole Simmons quietly prepared to leave the aircraft with the corporate team. Before stepping into the jet bridge, Daniel paused and turned toward Monica one last time. "I hope one day I earn the opportunity to demonstrate that I learned from today." Monica answered with calm sincerity. "Learning begins the moment we stop defending our assumptions and start examining them." Daniel gave a respectful nod before walking away. Charles looked around the cabin once more. "The future of this airline will not be measured only by on-time departures or financial reports," he said. "It will be measured by whether every passenger is treated with equal dignity before anyone knows their profession, income, appearance, or influence." Monica quietly added, "Today was never about removing one person from one seat. It was about removing the belief that respect must be earned through status. Every traveler who walks through our doors deserves to feel that they belong before anyone asks who they are." Those words settled gently over the cabin as the final boarding door prepared to close. Outside, the morning sun reflected across the wing once again, but inside the aircraft something even brighter had begun to emerge. It was the quiet understanding that true leadership does not announce itself through authority. It reveals itself through fairness, humility, and the courage to see every person with equal worth. The cabin door finally closed with a quiet click, and for the first time that morning the aircraft felt exactly as it was designed to feel. Calm. Focused. Ready to move forward. The replacement captain welcomed everyone aboard, completed the safety announcements with steady professionalism, and within minutes the aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate. Monica Hayes remained by the window in seat 1 Alpha, watching the terminal gradually drift behind them. The same jet bridge where assumptions had taken shape was now disappearing into the distance, growing smaller with every foot the aircraft rolled backward. Richard Lawson looked across the aisle and smiled. "I think every person on this flight is leaving with more than they expected." Monica returned the smile. "I hope they leave with perspective." As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Olivia Bennet quietly opened her notebook instead of reaching for her phone. She had decided not to publish a sensational headline or reduce the morning to a dramatic confrontation. Some stories deserved reflection before attention. Thomas Reynolds adjusted his seat and looked toward Monica one final time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for reminding us that dignity should never depend on recognition." Monica inclined her head with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for speaking when it mattered." Emily Carter completed the final cabin check, moving with renewed confidence. She paused briefly beside Monica before taking her jump seat. No words were necessary anymore. The lesson had already been shared. Outside, the aircraft turned onto the runway and paused for clearance. Engines gradually increased in power, their steady sound filling the cabin with quiet anticipation. Monica rested one hand on the notebook that had accompanied her throughout the journey. Several new pages would soon be filled, not with disappointment but with solutions. Better training. Better accountability. Better listening. Because lasting change never came from exposing failure alone. It came from choosing what to build afterward. The aircraft accelerated smoothly, lifting away from the runway until the city below became a pattern of streets, buildings, and rivers fading beneath scattered morning clouds. Looking out the window, Monica thought about every traveler who would board one of the company's airplanes tomorrow without anyone knowing their profession, income, neighborhood, or influence. That was the traveler who mattered most. If the airline could earn that person's trust, then it had truly earned everyone's. Charles Whitmore looked back from the forward galley before returning to his seat farther behind the cabin. He smiled quietly, knowing the most important board meeting of the year had taken place without a conference table, a presentation screen, or prepared remarks. It had unfolded inside a single aircraft where character had spoken louder than titles. Monica closed her notebook and looked once more across the peaceful cabin. No applause filled the air. No cameras flashed. There was only the quiet rhythm of an airplane climbing toward its destination and a shared understanding that every person aboard had witnessed something worth carrying long after the flight ended. She had never needed people to recognize the chief executive officer. She only wanted them to recognize the humanity sitting in seat 1 Alpha before they believed it belonged to someone important. As the morning sun poured across the wing, one truth remained brighter than everything else. A title can open a boardroom door, but character opens every door that truly matters, and respect becomes meaningful only when it is offered before anyone knows who is receiving it.